Hello everyone, welcome to this very important program on the Japanese Constitution. My name is Richard Albert, I teach constitutional law here at BC. Today's program is titled The War on Japan's Pacifist Constitution. It's a provocative title, but I think also an appropriate one. You're in for a real treat today, because I don't think there's a better trio out there than the one we've assembled for you here today to discuss what's happening in Japan from legal, historical, constitutional, and comparative perspectives. Really think there's no better trio. I'll tell you about our group in just a moment, but first I want to thank Vlad Perju, who is the director of the Clough Center for the Study of Constitutional Democracy, for hosting this very, very special event. This is just one of the many amazing programs that Vlad hosts under the auspices of the Clough Center, and I think we owe him a debt of gratitude. Last week, the Clough Center was a forum for discussions on the Canadian Constitution, the Colombian Constitution, Hungary, Russia, Turkey, the United States, at a conference on constitutional law. And today, of course, our subject is Japan. And so thank you, Vlad, for bringing the world to our doorsteps here at Boston College Law School. So why Japan, and why now? The Japanese Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, has long been a proponent of revising the Pacifism clause in the Japanese Constitution. Entrenched in Article 9, this clause commits Japan to, quote, forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation, and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. Rewriting this clause has been one of the LDP's founding goals since 1955, and Abe has seen his role as helping to achieve this as yet unfulfilled objective. When he became Prime Minister for the first time in 2006, he stressed above all his intention to amend, revise this pacifism clause. He was elected again in 2012, and he's since revived his plans to revise this clause. And so today's discussion will help us understand why, and also whether his efforts actually do pose a threat to constitutionalism in Japan, because I think that remains an open question. Three very special guests are here to help us understand the history, the law, and the implications of Abe's efforts to revise the Pacifism Clause. Each speaker will have about 12 minutes for their remarks, and then we'll have an open-ended conversation, an opportunity for you to make comments and to ask questions. So I want to introduce our guests, and I'll do so in reverse speaking order. Our third speaker will be Tom Ginsburg, the Leo Spitz Professor of International Law and Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. He holds 3 degrees from Berkeley, a BA, a JD, and a PhD. He's taught as a distinguished visitor in many countries, and he's consulted on constitutional and institutional design in many, many other countries, a list that includes Italy, Israel, Korea, Japan, Nepal, Mongolia, the Netherlands, Tunisia, Montenegro, I'm running out of breath, Tom, Afghanistan. And now I will stop, because I really could go on for the rest of the afternoon, and I have a con law class to teach at 1:30. He has recently partnered with Google to create an important online resource called Constitute. It's a project that he developed with the support of Google Ideas to explore how technology can support and improve constitutional design. Constitute is designed to allow drafters, academics, indeed anyone, anywhere in the world, to find and compare the world's constitutions in an easy and understandable way. It's a really powerful tool and a very cool one. I encourage you to take a look at it online. I won't list all of Professor Ginsburg's books and publications, but believe me when I tell you that it's no exaggeration to say that in the field of constitutional design, there is Tom Ginsburg, and then there's everyone else. Our second speaker will be Tokujin Matsudaira, an associate professor of law at Kanagawa University in Japan. Professor Matsudaira has traveled from Japan for this event, and we thank him for his efforts in that respect. It's not an easy trip to make, particularly during the school year. He is now in the midst of the school year in Japan. Professor Matsudaira writes about constitutional change in Japan, about the judicial process, about the judicial role, and also about Japanese foreign policy. He holds degrees from the universities of Tokyo and Washington. When he's not teaching and writing, Professor Matsudaira provides, I think, an indispensable service to comparative constitutional scholars. He maintains an electronic newsletter that updates scholars around the world on the latest developments in Japan, things that would otherwise be inaccessible to those of us who don't speak and read the language. As I said, it's a valuable service that gives useful context and analysis on Japanese constitutional law and politics. And so today, Professor Matsudaira will update us on these current developments in Japan in connection with the pacifism clause. But our first speaker will be our very own Franziska Seraphim, an associate professor of history here at Boston College. Professor Seraphim studies modern and contemporary Japan. Her work seeks to understand and help us understand the contested place of empire and war in Japanese political culture. She holds degrees from Berkeley and Columbia. Professor Seraphim's seminars have focused on the Allied occupations of Japan and Germany, the place of memory in history, and comparative and transnational history and historical writing. She's written an important book, a very important book, on war memory and social politics in Japan, 1945 to 2005, and she's currently researching questions of rehabilitation and citizenship in the politics of social integration and exclusion after World War II in Japan and in Germany. And so today, Professor Seraphim will give us some needed historical context on war, on peace, and on constitutionalism in Japan. And so with that, thank you for being here, and please help me in welcoming Professor Seraphim to take the floor.
Thank you very much for this very wonderful and warm introduction. And thank you especially for putting Japan on the mental map of the law school here in these volatile times politically in Japan and internationally, and very much for bringing the three of us together as well. So let me take just a few minutes to set the historical stage, so to speak, for our main objective, the discussion of current constitutional revisionism. I also wanted to draw attention to an upcoming symposium along these same lines, in case you want to do more along these lines, at the Reischauer Institute for Japanese Studies at Harvard, on Friday, November 14th, so next week on Friday, from 4 to 6, entitled Strategic Dilemmas, Constitutional Revision and Japanese Politics. And that's with panelists Dick Samuel from MIT, Sheila Smith from the Council on Foreign Relations, and Keigo Komamura from Keio University. So if anybody's interested, that's another opportunity to continue this conversation. Japan's current constitution was promulgated on May 3rd, 1947, when Japan was under military occupation by the Allies, led by Douglas MacArthur, and has never been formally revised or amended. Instead, it has been reinterpreted, and until recently, these reinterpretations have tended to focus on Article 9, the so-called Peace Clause. It reads, and I think you have this on your handout, aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized. Japanese historians generally agree that this article represents a political manifesto, a general principle constraining state action similar in importance to the First Amendment in the US Constitution, except that instead of limiting state power vis-a-vis its citizenry, this limits state power vis-a-vis other countries, the most powerful legal legacy of Japan's ill-fated war in Asia and the Pacific. No matter what the origin of this article, and no matter what the politics of revisionism in the 1950s and 60s and beyond, the Constitution with Article 9 at its center was firmly embraced by the Japanese people as a cornerstone of post-war Japan. This is probably the closest Japan has come to a consensus on war memory, and it is a general commitment to pacifism. Today's frontal attack on the Constitution therefore represents a serious challenge, not just to law and to politics, but to the meaning of Sengo, that is, the almost 70 years of post-war history. Constitutional revisionism is not a new phenomenon, but it has also not been a continuous phenomenon. Efforts to revise Article 9 and to prevent such revision have centered primarily on the 1950s, the 1990s, and today, which suggests the importance of historical context. And I wish I had enough time to lay that out more for you, but I don't. The issues, meanwhile, have remained largely the same. Following Boyd and Samuels, there are three. One, the problem of the Constitution's origins, which is seen as an impediment to national autonomy. Two, the unusual constraints Article 9 places, not just on Japan's military, but also on its foreign policy vis-à-vis Japan's main partner, the United States, which is seen as an impediment to national muscularity. And three, the obvious incongruences with reality, given that Japan does have a very well-equipped modern military, which is seen as an impediment to national honesty. The mandate to write a new constitution after the war was anchored in the Potsdam Declaration of summer of 1945, that is, in Japan's unconditional defeat. Until then, the Meiji Constitution, promulgated in 1889, had provided the constitutional framework for Japan as a modern nation state that came to develop a bicameral political system, guaranteed a range of civil liberties, granted universal male suffrage, but ultimately legitimized an atrocious war, in part because the military was directly responsible to the emperor and not to the Diet or the parliament. And the emperor was the seat of national sovereignty, not the people. How to preserve a Japanese national essence while dealing with the obvious inadequacies of the Meiji Constitution became so divisive an issue among Japan's post-war leadership that the American occupation authorities stepped in and gave its legal team exactly 10 days to come up with a democratic constitution. How much Japanese input and from whom was solicited in those 10 days is unclear, but the Japanese Diet passed the new law with relatively minor revisions, and it has remained intact ever since. No sooner had this constitution gone into effect in 1947 than the US regretted Article 9 and made it known that it fully expected Japan to revise it when it regained its sovereignty. As China fell to the communists and the Cold War rivalry with the Soviets deepened, the United States and Japan crafted a bilateral political, economic, and security relationship that has defined Japan's place in the world ever since. Known as AMPO in Japan, this security treaty, which accompanied the San Francisco Peace Treaty of 1951, which ended the occupation, allowed the United States to maintain military bases in Japan. This subordinate independence, as it was called, galvanized both the Pacific left and the nationalist right. The left embraced Article 9 to ensure that no Japanese would have to fight and die in another war if Japan was forced to let the US use Japanese territory for its military activities. The right despised Article 9 as yet another tool to keep Japan on its knees. But both protested against Japan's subordination to the United States. Meanwhile, the conservatives split on this issue, and this is the crucial point. While the national right wing sought constitutional revision, conservative pragmatists, led by Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru, realized the value of Article 9 as a tool to manage Japan's military alliance with the United States, protecting vital economic interests while fending off American demands for rearmament, and, importantly, underwriting a widely popular pacifist identity pioneered by the socialist opposition. So it is not just a matter of a political left and political right, but rather the split amongst the right and the selective collaboration with the left is what explains why this has remained in place for so long. And thus the contradictions that characterized Japan's constitution were institutionalized in the 1950s with the help of the Cabinet Legislation Bureau, which ruled in 1952 that Article 9 did not prevent Japan to use force for its self-defense. Japan established a Ministry of Defense in 1953 and inaugurated a military called the Self-Defense Forces in 1954, while Article 9 remained in place, even though it says what it says. In many ways, Japan had its cake and could eat it too. Although demands to address the underlying contradictions in this arose periodically over the next decades, they were largely overshadowed by other issues between the mid-60s and early 90s. So I'm not arguing that it went away, but it wasn't a major focus. This changed in the early 90s. And again, you have a major contextual shift that explains this, and it works on the international, domestic, and popular levels, just as it did in the 1950s. This came really into the public with the first Gulf War, when the US complained about Japan's checkbook diplomacy and demanded that Japan send troops overseas, you know, as blue helmets under UN auspices, to help fight this war. And it set Japanese politics into turmoil. Again, this was largely, first of all, about the US-Japan relationship. The Peacekeeping Operations Bill authorized the Diet to vote on a case-by-case basis to let SDF troops go overseas. But the context had changed dramatically, and not just internationally. A rising China and Korea galvanized the nationalist right in new ways. And at the same time, the 1955 system, the way that the right and the opposition left had consolidated around two political parties, was falling apart. Probably the most important part of this is that the socialist opposition let go of its decade-long opposition to the AMPO treaty, that is the security treaty with the US. At the same time, the LDP also fell apart and regrouped in new ways. And through all of this, the nationalist right actually gained in popularity. So it has to do with the relationship with the US, it has to do with the relationship with Asia, it has to do with domestic politics. And what you get is a wide popular debate about the Constitution. Since 2000, many drafts have come out and have gone on the table. Newspapers have been importantly invested in this and have popularized it. So this debate now goes in all directions and involves everybody. But what stares us in the face today, and what is the topic of our discussion here, is that the Abe administration has surrounded itself with the nationalist right that is coming out from behind in new ways and with new force in this changed context, and effectively has changed the name of the game. Thank you.
Professor Matsudaira, please.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, the Clough Center, and thank you so much for coming. The 20 minutes is quite short, so I'll just jump to my PowerPoint. I'm coming here not to tell you that things suddenly become worse just because Mr. Abe came to power, became the prime minister. The situation has been worsened for years. As I just picked a 2008 Supreme Court case, And so the case will tell you is how difficult for Japanese minorities to make protest on the street. That's what one of my colleagues called is a birdcage democracy. Because the Japan Supreme Court interpret the Constitution in very conservative fashion. And so how the things going, how bad is in Mr. Abe's 2 years? As to Article 9, well, I would say we are lawyers, so basically it's a matter of interpretation. So originally the argument was about the constitutionality of self-defense force. And basically the Supreme Court refused to make the judgment. And Professor Seraphim mentions the Cabinet Legislation Bureau interpreted Article 9 basis a ban on offensive military alliance. So it is possible, according to the CLB, for self-defense purpose, even use nuclear weapon against any foreign force attacking Japan. And so I think the situation we have now is it seems the LDP government is pursuing another kind of strategy, not to amend the Constitution directly, but in a fashion, what I call is amending the Constitution without formal constitutional amendment. This is what the Deputy Prime Minister also indicate in an interview. So this is what he said: the Weimar Constitution was still there when Nazis came to power, and then it just disappeared without big disturbance. We should learn from the history. So what will be the next part? If Article 9 reinterpretation, there is no limit of interpretation. So what about the constitutional rights? And what about the military draft? And in fact, according to LDP, it is possible to have a military draft, but just LDP won't do that during Prime Minister Abe's term. And other bad things happened in his 2 years. The first is the partisan control of public broadcasting. NHK originally was created as a Japanese version of the BBC, but you can see the right-hand guy is Mr. Momoi. He said in his first conference openly that he will do everything government ordered him to do. And the right hand, he's a novelist. He writes about the Japanese zero fighters story. And he has openly argued that the Japanese Imperial Army did nothing wrong except losing the war. And now we have the hate speech against ethnic Koreans. And you can see the placard reads, the South Korea is not evil, it's the enemy. So let's kill Koreans. And I think there may be difficult for you to understand. It is nothing to do with the current relationship between Japan and North Korea or South Korea. In fact, Mr. Abe thinks he has something similar with North Korean dictator. They have something common interest. So that's why now the Japanese government is negotiating with the North Korean government, despite the U.S. approach. And what target is ethnic Korean people. They have been living in Japan from the colonial period. And the third is the LDP local politician. This is his Twitter. He argued there is no Ainu people in Japan. And as you know, Ainu people is the native people of Japan and invaded by the Japanese. And in 1989, the court ruling, the first is by judicial approval of their status as indigenous people. But now this gentleman says there is no such Ainu people exist. And this is the most interesting one. I hope I want to share with you. It's Mr. Akaike. He's now a member of the upper house representing LDP, attend to the upper house commission on constitution. This is what he said. So the thing of the post-war constitution is it was imposed thus unconstitutional constitution. And Article 9 was American conspiracy, awakening Japan. And the preamble and human rights provisions, because they are fictitious social contract, ignoring Japanese history and tradition. And we also have Article 24, is prescribing that family laws should be enacted from the standpoint of individual dignity and essential equality of the sexes. And Article 27 is providing constitutional guarantee of labor rights. According to Mr. Akaike, these two provisions are a reflection of the Soviet constitution. So that's why Japanese socialists and communists love these two provisions. And I think there's a reason for LDP to turn to right. And first part, what the current LDP is doing is not far from their ancestors. Their conservative ancestor has argued in past 50 years. For example, I picked the example of ex-Prime Minister Kakue Tanaka. Basically, they share some common trait. There's a very strong anti-elite emotion. And there's a very strong emphasis on ethnic Japanese and hatred against the idea of citizenship. However, Prime Minister Tanaka never indicate he want to alter or change Article 9. Because he was a soldier in World War II, he knows what happened. So there's another side is the shifting to the far right. Is a decline of the old conservatism. So the reason is quite simple because due to the growth, the high economic growth, the local communities collapsed, dismantled. Ironically, it results in a decrease in vote for LDP. So it means LDP need to find a new loyal supporters. Where they get? It's a far right on social media, internet, and religious right wing, like right wing Buddhism. We call it Nichienshu, or Unification Church, or the former state Shindo. and they form an organization. It's called Nipponkai. And then why there's no other options for LDP except to turning right? I think there is two structural deadlock forcing LDP to choose the right term. The first is old issues. This is I think in the area of area studies, you know about this is a myth about Japan. There is communal authoritarianism. There's caste-like social inequity, very negative to social ethnic diversity, and bureaucratic states. So it's a lack of counter speech, etc., etc. But they also, I think there's the impact of globalization. So since there's the high economic growth and wherever there states decline, and there's no social economic flow, and we have just experienced the 311, the big earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear crisis. And the modern government lacks such ability to deal with this new kind of emergencies. So I think in a comparative ground, we have a famous French philosopher, Rancière. He argued about how we should rescue democracy in the time of globalization. That's why he said is that the point, I think the second one is that the modern politics is some kind of distribution of the sensible, means the people's feeling. Because now, thanks to the social media, people became very easy to get hurt. But what Mr. Abe chooses is psychological compensation in very cheap ways. So he chose both neoliberal idea of market states and neocon idea of a national security state. And for adding the social economic gap, he chose something the out-of-date success story. It's the older generation has experienced. As you may know, it's a major restoration, or Japan has a very successful manufacture, or the dream brought by the Olympic Games, etc., etc. And the steering of the media and feel-good populism. And so, as a result, the post-war constitution became a scapegoat for the current deadlock. The people doesn't feel good. So, conclusion is what this means. So quoting a Keio political science professor, Professor Katayama, this is not the new story. It basically is an unfinished fascism will come soon. The time is coming, so just very little is how constitutional scholars in Japan respond to the current crisis is constitutionalism versus democracy. Is it right? I have no answer. Maybe Professor Komamura, you will come next week. He can give you more clear answer about that. Ironically, maybe this is the last thought, because the bureaucracies fail or ignorant of the current crisis, and the CLB just take another appeasement policy, and the Supreme Court is unwilling to defend the Constitution, except its own autonomy. And so maybe we only have the emperor and the empress to be the guardian of the Constitution. Thank you very much.
thought I'd make a few comparative comments, but also talk a little bit about Japan in particular. So the first point is that constitutions always and everywhere are, we tend to think of them as we the people getting together and articulating our fundamental values and figuring out how we're going to be governed. And that's never been true, and I think the Japanese case really illustrates that general point, which is that constitutions are usually produced with some sort of outside involvement, maybe not as stark as this case, but they're always produced in an international context, right? That is, and you think about our own American experience. The American Constitution, the whole purpose of getting together in Philadelphia was because the earlier system did not produce enough machinery, really, to defend the fledgling nation. And so they decided they had to rewrite things, and without that kind of external threat, we wouldn't have gotten this great Constitution we have. So that's a kind of general point. Now, it follows, I think, that as the international environment changes, we will see pressure on domestic constitutional bargains to adjust as well. And we've seen that in the course of the United States. As we become more powerful, I think we pay less attention to the rest of the world. That's probably pretty normal. In Japan, it's in a way the reverse. That is, having been dependent on the United States for security for so long, in an era with a rising and aggressive China that's making land grabs in the neighborhood, in an era where American credibility is declining, where we draw red lines and then redraw them, it's only natural there would be some pressure to renegotiate and rethink the Japanese internal constitutional arrangement when it comes to security policy. The interesting thing to me is, and I don't really have a problem with that, the interesting thing to me is that the basic constitutional coalition in Japan still seems to be largely in place. That is, despite all this discussion and the new drafts that are being produced, it appears that Abe will not succeed in his plan to amend Article 9, which you have in front of you, and his secondary plan to amend Article 96, the article which provides for the amendment formula to make it easier to amend the Constitution with an ordinary majority. Doesn't seem like that's going to work either. And that, to me, suggests that there is a kind of core consensus somewhere in the Japanese polity that this current interpretation, which does allow for very significant defense expenditures, but doesn't allow for certain categories of weapons, is maybe where they want to be, and the coalition may hold. So that's kind of a revisionist point compared to some, if I could use the term, compared to some of what we heard earlier. I want to talk a little bit about the modality by which constitutional change occurs, because this, you've heard a lot about the Cabinet Legislation Bureau. And just to make the comparative point that, in the United States, we look to the courts to modernize our Constitution and to informally amend it when formal amendment proves too difficult. And in at least some other countries, the courts aren't really available. And the Japanese Supreme Court is really a very peripheral actor when it comes to these core issues. The Cabinet Legislation Bureau is a very interesting operation. It's, as Matsudaira informed me last night, it actually was created in the 1870s, sort of on a French model. Those of you who know anything about France know they have this thing called the Conseil d'État, the Council of State, which has existed since before the French Revolution. French constitutions come and go. There's a joke. A guy goes into the library to get a copy of the French Constitution. The librarian says, "We don't stock periodicals." But France persists, and there's kind of small c constitution in France, and the Conseil d'État is certainly part of that, the bureaucracy, as a major actor. Not usually mentioned in any formal constitutions in any country. And Japan is clearly a country which is, in many senses, a bureaucratic polity, a bureaucratized state. And the bureaucracy is its own actor. So the Cabinet Legislation Bureau, of course, is formally responsive to these politicians, but in many ways has acted, I think, in the course of these reinterpretations to resist short-term political pressure. And you go back to the 1950s, they do sort of accommodate the demand for change, but at the same time, they don't go all the way. And I think we're still seeing that today. The bureaucracy is a conservative actor in Japan, and they care about the Japanese place in the world, but they're not really a revisionist actor in the sense of wanting to change Article 9 and move ahead. What does the bureaucracy want? What bureaucrats want everywhere. They want control over the decision, they want to restrain, they want autonomy. And I think the CLB that's the role they've been playing in this development over the preceding decades. And it's an interesting one. It's not just completely unrestrained politicians, and that's important to note too. The third point I want to make is that even if there is and it's a general point actually, again, with regard to the role of constitutional text. You see in front of you that it says, Japanese people forever renounce war, and land, sea, air forces, and other war potential will never be maintained. Now, I'm not sure what the current estimates are. The last time I looked, Japan had the third highest defense spending of any country in the world. Maybe it's fourth now. The point is that they have a very well-equipped military. Does that mean that these words are useless? No. It's analogous in some ways to the war clause of the United States Constitution. You know, Congress has the power to declare war. The last war they declared was 1939 or 41, I guess, in World War II. They've only done it 4 times in American history. But the fact that Congress has that power in the Constitution gives Congress a kind of property right in decisions about war, which they've fought over. And most famously over the War Powers Act, which the presidents always say is unconstitutional, yet they often follow its dictates. It's a very interesting thing where the presidents, you know, say that they have exclusive power to wage war policy, despite the text, but they often act in ways that make it quite clear they're scared a little bit of Congress and the War Powers Act. For example, Clinton, in bombing Kosovo, made sure he got everything done by the 86th day before the 90-day period of the War Powers Act required. I think the Japanese Article 9 plays the same role. It does play this limitation. They don't have offensive, they don't have any nuclear weapons, not even the defensive ones they might be allowed to have, and there's certainly a limit on the kind of things they can do, and it's been a restraint on unrestrained political power. So there is a kind of deep, small c constitutionalism here. You don't get it all from just looking at the words on the paper. My final point, how are we to think about these efforts to revise the Constitution? Well, I think Abe Shinzo is the most dangerous man in East Asia, actually. I think he's really quite dangerous because he doesn't, as I've said, the system as a whole has adjusted over time, arguably to meet the objective needs of the Japanese polity in the international environment. When you start talking about changing the Constitution to have an actual army, which is the language he uses, in a region where it's an extremely hierarchical worldview of nations in competition with each other, in a region where no one forgets anything, right, where memory is, you know, really strong, that's an extremely provocative act. And I think that that's why I think that, you know, the status quo, this kind of moderate, you know, adjustment over time is the way to go with regard to Article 9. Much more disturbing are the points that Matsudaira-san was making about the internal order in Japan and the rising racism and xenophobia and the lack of, well, it's a certain form of memory, right? A certain kind of sacralized memories of World War II, which really do seem to me to be a real attack on the democratic basis of the Constitution. And that's much more scary to me than the Article 9 stuff. Thanks.
We have a lot to discuss, so I'm happy to open up the floor for questions and comments. Just please raise your hand and I'll recognize you.
We can also ask each other questions.
Yeah, and as you think of your questions, perhaps the panelists want to respond to a comment that was made by one of your fellow panelists. Yes,
Can
please.
I say something? Thank you very much to both of you. That was very interesting. I do, though, wonder, and this has much to do with the media also and the way that we report on Japan, but it also comes up on these panels a lot, that we pay, I think rightly, enormous attention to these really incredible right-wing attacks on, you know, along racist lines and so on. And I do want to emphasize that I think it's important to pay proper attention to this, but that is hardly the whole story. For whatever reason, we don't cover what other voices in Japan have to say, and they speak fairly loudly too. You know, it's difficult to know exactly how the power has shifted, and some are not as articulate anymore as they were 5-10 years ago, but there's a lot going on in Japan. There are organizations that protest what Abe is doing. There are long-standing groups, Global Article 9 Association or Kyujunokai, and you know, from scholars to grassroots organizations that pool thousands and thousands of people. I went to a Global Article 9 campaign in 2009 and covered it for our Harvard project, and there were over 10,000 people there, up in arms about what's going on with Article 9. These things do take place in Japan. This is not a country that's going, completely right-wing, and we have our own religious right in this country, and would not therefore assume that the entire country, has fallen off the democratic, edge. So I wonder to what extent we really do need to place this a little bit in perspective, or not only report on the right, scary as it is, and important as it is, but to put this a little bit into perspective and give the Japanese people a little bit of credit for what they're doing as well.
Yes, please.
So obviously this was a talk about Abe and the LDP, but I just wonder, where's the DPJ in all this? What is their approach to this, and how is it affecting sort of their own internal politics?
You want to talk about the DPJ?
Very briefly, well, the DPJ did want a lot of responsibility for the current situation, because the election of 2 years ago, in fact, LDP's vote didn't increase. It's on the contrary, decrease. But the trouble is, those who once voted for DPJ deeply disappointed, and they refuse to vote. So, yeah.
If I can,
that's the point I want.
right. If I can just add something, I mean, when the LDP first came out with their new draft constitution, 2005 or 2006, Minshuto, they followed with their own draft, which was basically the same thing with a couple words different. So I think they've been very reactive in this. They don't really have strong views. They certainly don't oppose reform if reform is popular, but they don't seem to be. They don't have a strongly well thought out position or anything like that. They seem to be very reactive, from my perspective.
Katie?
I guess that relates to my question. I was just wondering, in describing the movement of the right and any counter movements, what the role of pacifism is, whether it still plays a role, or if there is a particular conception of Article 9 that is on the defensive but still rejects pacifism. Is pacifism still, does it have currency in Japan at the moment, or is that off the table and there is another sense of post-World War II constitutionalism which is seen to be something worth defending?
Let me answer briefly. Ironically, I think the Article 9 is the most deeply rooted constitutional division. I have 500 undergraduate students. If you ask them which article states about the free speech, most of them they couldn't answer. But most of them, they can exactly answer about Article 9. Yeah, so I think it's something, Article 9 has some power appealing to ordinary people, that we don't want to solve controversies via war, and there should be no pre-war military democracy come again, because especially for the older generation, they have a personal experience. They know how the pre-war military police working on, and especially for the civil bureaucrats.
I guess the reason I ask is there still seems to be some acceptance of war delegated to the Charter of the United Nations, and the sense that the international community has the right to use force through that instrument. So it's not strictly a pacifist ideal of no war, and the encouragement of ideas of no war as the end to war, because in a sense Article 9 does concede that. So I wondered about how they justify then delegating war to an international body?
Yeah, it's a good question because the team responsible for the reinterpretation, there is no constitutional scholar inside. So the argument is quite strange. They bypass constitutional justification, jump to international law, jump to the UN Charter. As last night, that's why I told Tom it's a very tricky argument because there is a UN Charter. There's a UN Charter say you must do something, even your constitution say you cannot do. But I think as a common sense is the opposite. Basically, international law demands you not to do something your constitution say you can do.
Not to do something, yeah, right. Yeah. Can I just add something on that? For a long time, the interpretation was that collective self-defense was okay under the charter, but not under the Japanese constitution, right? That was kind of the intermediate step before we got to where we were now. And so, yes, but it does lead Japan to being in this odd position where the Security Council could require Japan to do something that it would not be able to do. And so that's been a delicate position. I took your question to be also more broad about pacifism among the society.
Right.
And at least among the people, I don't know, I don't have a good sample, but my sense is very deeply, hell, this is the only country that was ever hit with a nuclear weapon, and there's a sense of the horror of war still being there, and so there is a very broad pacifism, which is probably what explains the failure of Abe to actually get Article 9 changed.
But it's also, to add on to this, it may not be as sophisticated as you might want it to be. I mean, I don't think that the pacifism means that people actually sit and think these issues through. It's a much more sort of visceral underlying pacifism of we want nothing to do with war,
Yeah.
don't go near me kind of thing,
Yeah.
rather than actually a political position that you can, legally and politically,
Right.
see, lay a foundation to.
Right.
I see a couple of hands up, a few actually. Let's take two. First and then second.
I was curious about the fact that Prime Minister Koizumi, when he was pushing these legislation pieces, attacked the problem of Article 9 by looking for independent legislation pieces for the emergency acts and the events in Iraq. Whereas now Prime Minister Abe is seemingly attacking Article 996 and trying to reinterpret the Constitution instead. Is there a reason why he's trying to attack the Constitution as a whole instead of just passing an independent legislative measure to, say, attack the problem of the China air information problem, where they're having to report their flights to the Chinese aviation services, instead of what he's doing now, trying to push into higher constitutional reforms?
Should we answer that or take the other question?
We'll take the other question and then we'll let the speakers answer. Please, sir.
Thank you, panel. Now, in regards to the recent state security law, many have commented that its stringent punitive measures have served as an erosion of civil liberties. So I want to know whether or not you believe this portends an increased constraint upon independent media outlets and also a trend towards soft authoritarianism.
So we have two questions on the table. Who'd like to take a crack?
Maybe I'll just say something about the first one. Why attack the whole Constitution? Remember that Abe is, comes from a long line of revisionists. This was the dream of his grandfather, Kishi Nobusuke, and to some degree it's his great uncle, I guess, the Sato Eisuke, the longest serving prime minister in Japanese history. Yes, there's always been this revisionist faction in the LDP from the 1950s. He's part of that. His father, of course, was the foreign minister in the late 80s and such. And so there's like it's maybe to some degree almost a personal thing, as some theories of George Bush going into Iraq were. I don't have a comment on the state security law. I don't know. Do you want to say something about that?
Sorry, state security law?
Yeah, I don't.
What?
What's the name of the statute again?
I'll have to look it up. I believe it was issued in December 2013, and it's basically stringent measures for whistleblowers. So it's like 10 years if they're a civil servant. I think it was 5 years if it's like a
Oh, it's a state
Secrets.
Secret law.
law.
Secrets
Yeah.
law, yeah. Yeah.
That's hugely.
Well, because until now we don't have any statute protect the state's secrecy. So if you just take the government explanation literally, I think it is reasonable to have a law protect secret on the national security. However, what exactly these administrative agencies provide, at least they consider these should be the national secrecy, was some of them was so amazingly, I just cannot believe. For example, for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the red wine and red wine they keep for foreign guests. Yeah, it's a state secrecy. For what? So, you know what I mean? So, who has the power to direct what is the secret, what is not?
Yeah.
So, and the current statute that doesn't make it so in a clear fashion. That's one problem. And the second, there is a cultural issue. Basically, Japanese is very suspicious. If you're doing something, the government is doing something secret, and without explanation. And that's not as a cultural thing. It is not the Japanese tradition.
Mm-hmm.
You can see there are some politicians, for example, Ozawa Ichiro. I don't think Ozawa Ichiro is a bad guy, though I disagree on most his point of view. But his failure, his decline, his fall, basically as caused by his secrecy. You know, he do everything underground, and nobody know about, you know, what he's doing. So that's why there's so big popular criticism against the state secrecy law.
So in many ways, your question is well posed, because it sounds like this could be a gateway to what you described as soft authoritarianism. Good question. There was another question. Yes, and then Professor Perjou. Yes?
So from what you're saying, it sounds like there doesn't seem to be a real concern that Abe will succeed at actually revising or doing away with Article 9. What are the more immediate concerns, both in terms of what Abe might be able to actually do in terms of affecting change, or what the effects of this trend towards revisionism could be in the near future for Japan?
Should I answer?
Please.
Maybe I'll start. You know, I think in the United States, since 1900, there have been 9,000 constitutional amendments proposed. You know, 5 or 6 have gotten through. A lot of times you propose a constitutional amendment not to get it through, but to mobilize your supporters, to act as a red herring while you're doing other things. And it seems to me that this is really what's in the end going on. Maybe at some level he would have liked to have changed Article 9, but he's able to use it in very clever ways. So that's my perspective. I just also wanted to comment on the freedom of information thing. You know, Japan didn't even have a freedom of information law until 1996, I think. It's very, very new. So it's not really, there's not a culture of whistleblowers and people, you know, suing the government to get access to information. State secrecy is presumed, I think, and that's the point you were making. I agree with you.
Professor Perjou?
I had a similar question. I mean, goes back to Tom. So on the one hand, you say that he comes from an entire family of entire tradition of people who were revisionists, people who wanted to change Article 9. Yet at the same time, now it might be that he's using the entire conversation about Article 9 as a sort of red herring while he's trying to do other things. I mean, there is a way in which, you know, and Abe is part of a group of, you know, charismatic, very strong leaders. Now we know about this kind of people that they're quite sophisticated in how they go about getting to the stuff that they want. So once they discover that the state is sort of insufficiently politicized for their own purpose, that is that there are some pockets of autonomy, be that the court in some other system, be that the bureaucracy here, then they recalibrate their tools and sort of they go from there. So I just wonder what is it exactly he's trying to do? What do you think? How do you think he might react to the failure to amend the Constitution? Isn't there a sense that if you want to have long-lasting influence in a society, amending the Constitution or changing the Constitution or changing something very important in the Constitution is one way that you want to go about it. We were discussing during lunch briefly the story of Hungary. Hungary is an example of that. You want to really leave a very deep imprint in the society, or you can go about changing the Constitution.
Do you have thoughts, Matsudaira? I do think that's your question is basically right, that there's other things on the agenda, other structural changes he wants to accomplish, and this is part of a strategy of mobilizing people and getting people engaged in it. Just take the Cabinet Legislation Bureau itself, which is kind of the keeper of constitutional interpretation. You can imagine that if they felt that there is a threat to amend, that's going to change, sort of on a spectrum, their own interpretation at the margin. They're going to be more accommodating to political power. They might not go all the way so that they can go home at night and say, we are autonomous and we saved the nation. We're not just listening to what the politicians want us to do, but in some sense they are. They're being moved. So changing the course of the conversation, new weapon systems, and I don't doubt that they do feel a genuine threat to national security. I don't doubt that at all. It's just that, as in so many other countries, the way that plays out is, attacks on vulnerable minorities and, attacks on dissenters, and that's really very disturbing for those of us who like to think that Japan is a democracy.
Can I add to that? The reality is that nationalism is on the rise everywhere in Asia, and not just in Japan. And many people in Japan feel extremely pressured by Chinese, Korean, and other Asian nationalisms. I think what's really going on is that Article 9 may not actually be the main focus. What's happening in terms of changing the education reform is much scarier, I think. And that's where some of the, sort of turning back the clock metaphors actually are much more apt, I think. And then, with the 1995 attack by Aum Shinrikyo, by that, religious group, there's now a very different sense of religious freedom. So that's another part of the Constitution. So constitutional revisionism, I think, is very important, but it's not necessarily Article 9. But Article 9 is the one piece, as you say, that everybody knows. So that's in some ways the shield behind which many of us fear more important things are happening. And that has really to do with addressing a nationalism that is becoming more and more popular, and it does have everything to do with the Asian context.
I'm not sure it ever went away, actually. I remember when I was living in Japan in 1997, I guess, almost 20 years ago. It was the anniversary of the rape of Nanjing, as we call it, sometimes called the Nanjing Incident. On that day, obviously covered very widely in Chinese papers, only one of the Japanese papers had anything on it, and it was on page 30, like two little paragraph thing about this is the anniversary of our advance into China or something like that. It was a euphemism. So I'm not sure that it's really getting worse. This is why I think your work on historical memory is really important, that in some sense this is, it's not such a radical shift, it's just a kind of change in the balance of forces, I suppose. But
I mean, it
this
started
denial
at
has
that
been there for a
time,
long
yeah.
time, right? Or
Well, I mean, in many ways, what you're describing is a backlash against what happened in the early 90s, when all of these wartime atrocities were on the table, many in some ways for the first time, in really public view and international view. And within a few years, you have an incredible nationalist backlash against that. And that's what you were describing.
Right.
Whereas in 90, 91, 92, that's when I started my work. I mean, boy, we were all riding the wave of memory, and how all of these things were coming up, and finally the emperor was dead. You could talk about various things that you couldn't talk about before. I mean, it was amazing, and then it all fell apart. I mean, it was really quite astounding what happened in the course of that decade.
wasn't there an apology from Murayama or something like that?
Well,
Prime
there were
Minister.
plenty of apologies, beginning with the new emperor.
Yeah.
When he became emperor, the first thing he did, Akihito did, was go to Korea and apologize. And then you had 91, 93, 95, you really had this whole wave of apologies, also responding in part to the fact that Japanese historians actually came up with real documentation of the comfort women system as a state-sponsored system and so on. So there was no more denial in some ways, but of course, the illustrious right, came out with its particular tools. But I mean, the 1990s were a pivotal decade in all of this. It ended up completely differently than most of us had hoped.
Well, let me invite you to come say hello to our guests at the conclusion of our panel, which is now. Thank you very, very much for your time and your interest.
Yeah.